not because of like some latent evil in their heart, but because their virtues get hijacked. You know, Hitler is a good example. That is somebody who could say whatever you want about him. He loved the German people and he cared about the German people. But that love, I mean, is very, I mean, it's like I was reading an article a while back about the neurochemical oxytocin. And it's the chemical that basically makes sure that, a mammal mother doesn't eat her baby when she gets hungry. It's that in us, it takes the form of like increasing trust and empathy and so forth. But they've also done research and found that it also that it increases trust and empathy and all those things for your in-group. But because you're more protective of them, like feeling that way, it actually increases distrust toward anybody considered like in the out-group. And so it's like makes you love your child more and makes you hate like the foreigner more or something like that, And a lot of things are like that where it's really your virtues that get hijacked. I mean, if you think...
Yeah, dude, that's what we call a racist nowadays. You don't need to sugarcoat it, especially when talking about Hitler. So there's this guy, Darryl Cooper, who managed to fool a lot of normies on the left with a podcast he did a couple of years ago about the history of Israel and Palestine. Back then, most people thought he was based, but as time went on and the mask started slipping, it became clearer that this guy might actually be a Nazi. One thing you'll notice about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that some people hold the correct position that Israel is committing a genocide, no way around it, and they arrive at that conclusion from a place of empathy. Then there are people like Darryl who may hold the same position but for the wrong reasons. Because if this guy is a Nazi, the first box he checks is being anti-Semitic. So his stance doesn't come from a compassion for Palestinians, it comes from hatred of Jews. That's why you have to be careful about where you get your information. The reason behind someone's opinion matters just as much as the opinion itself. Now, back in 2024, he made an appearance on Tucker's podcast where he said that the real villain of World War II was Winston Churchill.
And so I do think it's fair to ask, like, what really was going on? So, for example, and I'm American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to, they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. Or just, I mean, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
So first of all, that's an insane statement to make, and one of the patterns you'll notice with Darryl is that he often tries to minimize, or in this case redirect, the blame away from Hitler while still throwing in some token criticism of him. That's what I call a sophisticated Nazi apologist. He's smart enough to know that openly defending Hitler would be too obvious and people would call him out immediately, so instead he sprinkles in just enough criticism to say, see, I'm not defending Hitler, while using the rest of his argument to downplay Hitler's crimes or shift the focus elsewhere. That's really the game with people like this. Their goal isn't to excuse Hitler outright, but to soften how people perceive him by muddying the waters. Now, as for Churchill, sure, there's plenty you could criticize him for, especially his foreign policies, but to claim that Churchill was the true villain of World War II is absurd. The historical record is clear. Hitler, Mussolini, and Emperor of Japan stand out as the central figures of some of the worst atrocities of that era. To pretend otherwise isn't historical analysis, it's distortion. And if you thought that statement was wild, make sure you are seated for the next one.
Why don't you just make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
That they're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You know, you have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like
First of all, let's start with his claim that Hitler had no plan for the millions of people he captured. Newsflash, Daryl, the plan was called Auschwitz. Hitler absolutely had a plan, and it was one of the most systematic, calculated genocides in history. And the way he tries to spin it is just grotesque. He claims the Nazis had to kill those people. Not that they wanted to, but they had to. No, they didn't have to kill anyone. That's pure revisionism. And then to make it worse, he frames it as if the killings were somehow acts of mercy so the victims wouldn't starve. But let's be clear, who put those people in concentration camps and starved them in the first place? The fucking Nazis. This is the pattern with him over and over. He twists the narrative just enough to soften the reality of what Hitler and Nazi Germany actually did during World War II. It's not historical honesty, it's apologism dressed up as analysis. Now, you might think that after his interview with Tucker, a guy like this would be the platform, people wouldn't want to have him on, etc. But you would be wrong. In fact, the meathead Joe Rogan decided to host him. So basically, Rogan gave a Nazi apologist a platform on one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And of course, Daryl went on to spew more of his Nazi apology.
Just in the back, first chance he gets, all right, then we'll have our war.
But is this pre or post concentration camps? Is this pre or post the beginnings of the Holocaust?
Yeah.
This is where it gets into that. Like, should we decide to stop something in its tracks at whatever cost of life? Because ultimately that is the right thing to do, because we're witnessing the genocide of a people, and then we're also witnessing a group that will remain in power that has not just committed genocide, but is committed to genocide.
Right. So what we were talking about and all of the points I was bringing up on Tucker were all from before that. In fact, they were from a full year before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. That was June 1941, and that's where most of the Jews lived. So if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union, he never even would have had access to those people.
I swear I'm not trying to interrupt this as often as I do, but the nonsense he is spewing is genuinely infuriating. First of all, the reason the Soviet Union ended up with the largest Jewish population was partly because the Jews in Poland had already been rounded up into concentration camps or murdered by Hitler. Before World War II, Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe, but that changed once Hitler built his camps and launched his systematic persecution. So to claim that Hitler wouldn't have had access to Jews if he hadn't invaded the Soviet Union is just flat out wrong. By that point, he already had millions of Jews from the countries he had invaded, most of them imprisoned in camps or already killed. So a lot of the things this guy says are simply wrong, and I think the reason for it is that he's trying to downplay what really took place during that period. Now, Daryl continues by giving some background on Hitler, where he came from, his move to Vienna, but during the podcast, Daryl refers to Austria and even Vienna, the capital of Austria, as Germany, which wasn't the case at all until Hitler came to power and decided to say, fuck it, I'm gonna take Austria. And from there, Daryl goes into what was Hitler's turning point in becoming who he did.
He gets an up-close look at this, and he doesn't like what he sees. And he says in Mein Kampf that it really caused him like a moral crisis, and an ideological crisis. He's like, are these the German people? Like, really? This is what we're talking about? And then he says, and this is the way he relates it. He says it was actually the key that unlocked everything else for him, is that he would say he realized, we could say he came to believe that yes, these German masses, they are in a sorry state right now, but the reason for that is that they're being manipulated by the Jews, by the Jewish press, by the Jews who own the theaters and put out the films and whatever else. All of it, they're being manipulated and corrupted by these people. And so for him, it became like I think, he had a lot of the same explanations and reasons you would hear from any anti-Semite then or now, banking and whatever. Like all those things were like in there. But I think the thing that gave it emotional valence for him is that his anti-Semitism was what allowed him to love the German people. Like it was like the only way for him that he could get around the revulsion he was feeling and actually being up close with the German underclass. Is he excused their faults by blaming Jews, and so his sense of love for his people. And I mean, look, Hitler's one of those guys. I noticed this when I was reading all the Jim Jones books and stuff, which I think I read probably all of. They're not very good. Some of them are interesting, like they're good reads, but you can't help but notice, especially after you've read several of the books, that the authors just cannot help but be like cynical and turn it into a polemic on every page. Like even the thing Jim Jones or Hitler did as a child, they have like negative editorializing to it and everything. And it's like...
So Daryl's biggest complaint about those authors is that they were too critical of Hitler, which, let's be clear, it's a completely insane thing to say out loud. The reason they were so critical is simple. This is the man responsible for 80 million deaths between 1939 and 1945. That seems like more than enough reason to be critical. And of course you've got a meathead like Joe Rogan who not only fails to challenge the nonsense Daryl is spouting, but actually agrees with it. Now let's move on because Daryl's not done with his Nazi apology campaign.
Important to know too that it's not like Hitler was going and giving big speeches at City Square in Berlin, going on and on and on about how we're going to kill the Jews, and the German people said, right on, like, let's go do it. That was like the speeches that are out there where he is talking about the Jewish question, like almost all of those are like internal Nazi party, like rally speeches, they're not him. He had to be careful about that. Like
No, he did not have to be careful about that. In fact, Hitler built his political career on two things, nationalism and anti-Semitism, two ideas that went hand in hand. He never held back in his speeches about the Jewish question. As a matter of fact, one of the key reasons Hitler rose to power was precisely because of his anti-Semitism. So if you're unfamiliar with that part of history, you might listen to this guy and think he's making a point, but once again, much of what he says is just downplaying the reality of what actually happened, making it impossible to dispute the label of Nazi apologist, especially when these are the kinds of statements he makes. Now, I should also point out that during this podcast, Daryl sometimes shares factually correct information, but the conclusions he draws from that information are so off and questionable that it's hard to understand how anyone could defend him from being called a Nazi apologist. But of course, you can always count on Rogan to do the things most of us wouldn't. Take his episode with Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. Let me get it out of the way, I don't like Douglas Murray. I think he's an Israel cheerleader and a genocide denier. That being said, during this episode, Dave and Rogan go all out defending Daryl, even after Douglas points out what a questionable guest he is.
An expert in anything.
Who's that other dude who thinks he's an expert on Churchill?
Darryl Cooper does not think he's an expert.
In fact, I think it's everybody else is always calling him an expert, and he's like, I'm just a history
Have
nerd.
you ever absorbed any of his material? Have you ever consumed any of his podcasts or anything like that?
I tried.
Yeah?
It's pretty hard to listen to somebody who says, I don't know what I'm talking about, but now I'm going to talk. Or I don't know about this. Or I'm not capable of debating this historian, but I'm going to just tell you what I think.
Yeah, but that's not exactly what Daryl was saying. I mean, Daryl's point of view, however you feel about this, what Daryl is saying is he doesn't really like doing debates. He likes to do long format stuff where he can really explain his position.
If you throw a lot of shit out there, there's some point at which I'm just raising questions is not a valid thing. Mm-hmm. You're not raising questions. You're not asking questions. You're telling people something. I feel you've opened the door to quite a lot of people who've now got a big platform who have been throwing out counter-historical stuff of a very dangerous kind.
You mean Daryl? Are you talking about Daryl?
Daryl, who's the other one?
I don't think Daryl has.
Derek,
I don't think there's anything dangerous about
what's the
what
other guy? Derek. What's his name? Cooper, is it? Which one is it?
No, that's
it's Daryl Cooper.
Daryl Cooper. Who's the other one? There was one I just checked on the way here. Daryl Cooper, and then Daryl Cooper, Ian Carroll. Look, these guys are not historians. They're not knowledgeable about anything.
No one's calling Ian Carroll.
No, but then why listen to their views on Churchill?
Daryl is incredibly knowledgeable.
He's not.
Yeah,
he's not.
I don't know what Dave is talking about, but no, Daryl is not knowledgeable at all. Much of what he says is either flat out wrong or heavily biased, and he consistently tries to downplay the crimes committed by the Nazis. I don't understand why Dave would even bother defending a guy like Daryl when so much of what he says is genuinely questionable. And as for Rogan saying there's nothing dangerous about what Daryl is saying, honestly, he might need a brain scan. It seems like ever since he drank the MAGA Kool-Aid, his brain can't even recognize biased or harmful opinions anymore.
Wildly, several reasons. One is, when he was offered to debate the current greatest living biographer of Churchill, he said, I can't, because he knows much more than me, and I admire his work and I've learned from it, but I can't possibly debate him. That's Andrew Roberts.
Right, but you don't have to be able to debate people to have opinions.
No, you don't have to debate people.
If it's not your thing.
But if you, for instance, but if you say, I've decided that Churchill is the bad guy in World War II.
It's not what he said. It's not what he said.
Neither Carroll nor Cooper have said that?
Well, listen, I don't know what Carroll said, but Daryl Cooper has not said that. What he said was he jokes with his friend Jocko, who's an Anglo-Saxon. He jokes with him, I think that Churchill was the secret villain of World War II. And what he's saying is by Churchill's actions, the war escalated.
That is the dumbest excuse I've heard in a long time. Just because you say it's a joke doesn't absolve you of responsibility for what you said, especially when the topic is World War II, where millions of people died.
He's not saying anything.
He's not just asking questions, then, is he?
No, but
the
claim isn't that he's just asking questions. Yeah, he has a point of view.
You can explain this better. He literally says he's
said
joking.
In the comment, he goes, listen, I'm being hyperbolic. And then he once again disclaimed, he goes, and I'm not claiming Churchill committed the most atrocities or was the worst part. But in many ways, I do view him as the chief villain, as my hyperbolic, provocative statement. But
what's
Douglas,
the point of that?
Well, okay, but Pat Buchanan wrote an entire book on this. Is he not allowed? Is he not an expert? Is he not allowed to be
He's
interviewed?
certainly not an expert. He can be interviewed. I've watched Pat Buchanan debate. I watched Pat Buchanan debate against Churchill historians, and he was absolutely leveled because he doesn't know what he's talking about.
When did Pat Buchanan debate and get leveled?
About 20 years ago.
I'm just
He
curious.
debated against Andrew Roberts and several other historians at Intelligence Squared in London. I was there. He didn't know what he was talking about. He had a contrary view, and it was interesting and stimulating to hear. But if you only get the contrary view, which is, isn't it fun if we all pretend Churchill was the bad guy of the 20th century? At some point, you're going to lead people down a path where they think that's the view. And that's horse shit of the most profound kind.
I don't think that's what he's trying to do.
I think that's exactly what they're doing. And the problem is that because your own platform has come about because you're a very successful comedian and much more, and you do ask questions, and you are interested. But there are a lot of people who have come along, partly I think because they've come on this show, who have come along and they've decided, I can play this double game. On the one hand, I'm going to push really edgy and frankly sometimes horrific opinions. And then if you say that's wrong, they say, I'm a comedian.
But wait a minute.
How can you tell me I'm just a comedian?
Well,
I'm just throwing stuff out
What
there.
horrific opinions that's wrong are you talking about specifically?
Once guys like this get into very obvious stuff, which is
guys like Daryl,
the ones I'm describing.
You
very
need to
clear.
listen to Daryl to really understand what he's saying. If you take Daryl's words out of context, Daryl has some of the most nuanced, balanced, and charitable views on all the figures in history.
Well, particularly Hitler, it seems.
No, you're wrong.
True.
You're wrong.
No, he is not wrong whatsoever. What fascinates me is that Rogan had nearly a 3-hour podcast with Daryl, during which much of the nonsense Daryl was spewing was directly to Rogan's face. Yet because Rogan is a meathead who only knows surface level information about the topics he covers on his show, he can't see through the bullshit. Instead of challenging his guest or pushing back on their talking points, he just nods along in awe.
Doesn't he? What did he call him? How did he describe him?
I think he compared him to a methed out psychopath who was holding an entire nation of people hostage, I believe was the way
He also
put it.
said on here that he wasn't anti-Semitic until the Holocaust. There were no speeches of Hitler's in the 1930s.
No, again, this is
No.
Listen, this on your show.
He said he was not public about it.
He said he was downplaying it to win over. He said there was a period where he was downplaying it to win over popular support in Germany.
Yeah.
It was his argument.
There is no historian of World War II who thinks that Hitler was downplaying anti-Semitism in the 1930s. That was what he was doing. He wrote a book about it in the 1920s. He got to power on it, and he grew his power on the back of it. The idea that you can argue that in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was downplaying the anti-Semitism, like, there's no historian who would agree with that. So why would you throw out the idea that in the 1930s, Hitler was not being anti-Semitic in public? That was what he was doing in public. He announces to the German parliament what he wants to do. So when you're throwing out claims like he was keeping it down in the 1930s, first of all, what are you doing? And secondly, why?
Okay. I mean, I think that it's kind of hard because I don't even know exactly what Daryl's point on that was. And so I'm not really in a position to argue what he was saying there. I don't think you're giving him the most charitable interpretation.
I don't need to give him the most charitable interpretation to be able to see what he's doing.
Okay, I think you're straw-manning him, I should say.
Look, anyone can look up what he said on this show and others, what these two guys in particular have said on repeated podcasts with both of you. It's an attempt to downplay Hitler and always to do down Churchill.
I don't think he downplayed
Hitler. You're saying I've
way
downplayed?
they...
Oh my god, once again, I think Rogan's brain is genuinely fried. Daryl downplayed Hitler and the Nazis' actions during World War II, and he did it right to Rogan's face without him even noticing. I'm honestly questioning how this is the same Joe Rogan who back in the day would challenge any guest the moment they started spouting nonsense. It's fascinating to think that this is the same guy. Now, as for Daryl, maybe some of you aren't convinced that he might be a Nazi apologist. So let's take a look at some of his tweets where he doesn't hold back and basically says the quiet part out loud. This may be putting it too crudely for some, but the picture on the left was infinitely preferable in virtually every way than the one on the right. So the picture on the left shows Hitler taking over France, and the picture on the right shows drag queens performing at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Apparently this guy would rather have Nazi-occupied France than a few drag queens dancing. I think that says everything you need to know about whether he's a Nazi. But I got more, so here's another one. Franco is a leader I greatly admire, the man for his time and place. So if you're not familiar, Francisco Franco was a Spanish general dictator and a Nazi sympathizer. And this is the guy Daryl admires so greatly. This is the real reason the DC establishment flipped its lid when Trump brought up Hunter Biden's corrupt ties to the Ukrainian natural gas company. They all do. They all sell the political access that voters provide to them. And somebody asks, how do you stop it? And Daryl responds with, democracy is a disease. Tyranny is the cure. Here's another one. Fascism is merely what happens when normal people realize that the left will never stop until they're forced to. Do you have a libertarian bias? I always thought of you as more of a non-racist fascist, if that even makes sense. It does make sense and it's a decent description. I meant that I generally accept the libertarian argument that prohibition only produces black markets. Until they're not, the popular imagination has it that fascism is elites imposing totalitarian control over society to protect their rule, but that's wrong. Fascism is when the vast middle says enough is enough and empowers someone to do whatever is necessary to restore order. Fascism always popular, but since the vast middle doesn't produce a society's intellectuals and culture markets, it's never remembered well after the fact. I know I say this whether or not there's a virus, but let's end democracy and put the military in charge. So these are just a few of his tweets from the past. There are plenty more, but I think this video is long enough as it is. That said, I would love to see Dave and Rogan try to defend some of Daryl's takes. It would bring me great joy to watch the mental gymnastics they'd have to perform in attempting to justify a Nazi apologist.